"The plan," Kieran replied, in what seemed like bemused surprise, his low voice barely above a low, chuckling rumble. Nia pursed her lips and looked at the large man disapprovingly. "Yes, the plan," she replied energetically, but managed to refrain from yelling again. "As in, what are we going to do once we arrive at that station?" Shida didn't dare to back the woman up in a similarly vigorous fashion, feeling that she should still refrain from behaving too familiarly around the human commander, despite his inviting demeanour. However, she also very much did want to know what the next steps would be going forward, so she attentively raised her ears and kept her eyes on Kyon. The commander's soft face kept its warm smile. However, his gaze turned serious as he looked back at Nia, and when he answered, his firm voice spoke in no uncertain terms. "We aren't going to do anything. Right now I can't be certain if I can rely on this new information or not, but one thing is clear. As long as we have you and them on board, we're not going anywhere near that station, which also means your travelling plans are postponed. The risk is way too high. And besides, deciding a course of action in a manner this possibly significant to the future of intergalactic relationships is far, far outside of my authority. What we will do is get this to the proper channels and let people way more qualified than we are handle the situation." Kieran's dark eyes scanned the women standing in front of him, sternly awaiting their reactions. She'd felt agitation rise up within her, and she nervously glanced over at Nia, hoping that maybe another outburst of James's sister would allow her to retain her passive position. Nia did indeed seem torn between giving Contra one again, or adhering to the commander's strict words. In the end, reason seemed to win out within her, as she clearly accepted that, in the end, Kyon had the ultimate authority here. This was a problem for Shida, however, since she didn't have the luxury to wait. "But sir, time is of the essence here," she said, half standing up in outrage before sinking right back into her chair, and managing to keep her voice just controlled enough to hopefully not sound disrespectful. "If we wait, who knows what will happen to James in the meantime? It's already been 3 weeks, so they could have already done who knows what to him. These people don't even shy away from murder, and the longer we wait, the more likely it is that they decide that they don't need to keep him around any longer." She looked at Kyon, her gaze a desperate plea that made all the other humans in the room look at her pitifully. Especially Nia seemed to sympathise with her protest, so she slowly walked over, positioning herself right next to the feline, and looked at the commander expectantly. Kyon looked back and forth between the two women, while the eyes of his subordinates were on him, expectantly awaiting his response. He then averted his gaze, looking down at the table in front of him, while he let out a long breath that sounded earnestly saddened. "I didn't want to have to be one to say this," he murmured lowly, his voice sad but certain. "But right now we don't even know if Mr. Oldwood is still alive. And while it is, given what you told us, a possibility, it remains just that. Officially, the human leader of the attack on the station is dead, and so far I have seen no evidence to the contrary. I know that you've risked and have gone through a lot to get here to us, in hopes of helping him, but I cannot risk many lives to try and save someone who is just as likely dead as he is alive right now. If he is alive, he will be rescued, but not by us. I wish I could do more, but the risk is too high." Shida was immediately ready to push back against his decision once again, this time with more force behind it. However, she was suddenly stopped by a hand, firmly planted on her shoulder. She shot around to look at his owner. Nia's face was stoic and calm, as she looked not at Shida, but at the commander instead, with an unflinching gaze. While she seemed calm, the force with which her hand clamped down on Shida's shoulder gave away how much effort it was taking for her to keep up that appearance. "Don't make things worse for yourself. There's nothing you can do now," she said, her voice just as forcibly calm as her demeanour. "In the end, his hands are just as tight as ours. No matter if he wants to help or not, if he acts without orders, he will endanger not just us or himself, but everyone, involved or not, even more than they already are. Besides, James can watch out for himself." The commander's darkened gaze remained directed away from her as she spoke. Shida clenched her fists and jaws tight, forcing down any response she had, no matter how much she wanted to shout it out in everyone's faces. "Don't make things worse," she told herself sternly, feeling that this was a good mantra to have for the moment. "Whatever you do, don't make things worse than they already are." "I think Shida could use some rest now," Nia commented, her grip on Shida's shoulder loosening, turning into a hand gently placed. "Do you still need her for anything else?" The commander shook his head. "I think I have what I need for now," he replied. Nia nodded. "I know she is technically still a prisoner, and I probably don't have the necessary permissions to," she started, However, Kion apparently already foresaw what she wanted to ask, and interrupted her with a waving hand. "I consider her and her friends to be of low risk. They may freely roam this deck as long as they remain untroublesome," he gave back. The implication being that Nia could also talk to them as much as she liked, as long as she did it on this deck. Nia nodded once more, before gently coaxing Shida out of her chair, leading her towards the door with a hand on her back. Nia glanced over her shoulder one more time, as the commander also got up out of his chair. "Greet the iamblt from me," she said, and although her voice was stoic, Shida couldn't help but feel that there was the faintest hint of a teasing undertone underneath it. Commander Kion immediately spluttered and had to clear his throat to suppress a restrained chuckle. "I'll be sure to do so," he said, a hint of hesitant nervousness in his voice. Right after that, the two women left the room meant for interrogation, and Shida silently led Nia to the holding cell that had been assigned to her. Shida felt the weight of her own unfulfilled expectations weigh down on her, and actually, she would have very much liked to be alone for a moment. However, since she didn't really want to send Nia away despite that, she opted for the second best thing, which was trying to distract herself from her own impotence. "We should probably go see the others as well," she said, trying and failing to bring a bit of excitement into her voice. "That'd be quite a surprise for them, learning that you of all people are on this ship." She wanted to prattle on for a bit longer, just to fill the empty air with words. However, she stopped once she noticed that behind her, Nia had sunken against the door, as soon as it had closed, and was now leaning there, with one hand covering her eyes, and the other holding her elbow, her breath having become shaky and irregular. The shock of the sudden change was enough to make her very momentarily forget her own troubles, and she quickly walked up to Nia. The problem was she didn't really know what to do. "Hey, She hesitantly approached Nia, reaching out a hand, but not touching her. "Are you all right?" Nia loudly sniffled, taking a moment before she answered. She rubbed her eyes before removing her concealing hand, revealing them to be wet and reddened, as he looked up at Shida apologetically. "Yes, I'm fine," Nia replied, briefly contorting her mouth into a quick smile in an attempt to calm Shida's nerves. "I just need a moment. This seemed like the best place to let it out a bit. Sorry." Shida didn't quite understand what that meant, but she was far from admonishing Nia from getting torn up about her brother's fate, even if this was a bit sudden. "Hey, it's okay, no need to apologize," she said, pulling her hand back and awkwardly but patiently waiting, while Nia took some time to quietly cry, constantly freeing her eyes from the tears as she did so. Then, after what probably had been a few minutes, although Shida had no exact grasp on the time that had passed, Nia reached into her pocket and pulled out a loudly rustling package of what must have been Earth's version of tissues, taking one of them out and cleaning her eyes and nose with it. As she rubbed her eyes, some very dark spots that looked like paint or ink were left behind on the striking white tissue. Squaring in place, Shida desperately needed something to say. Finally, she brought out the only thing that came to her mind. "I know you two are siblings and all, but you and James are really close, aren't you?" Nia crumpled up the tissue, storing it in her fist for a moment, and now genuinely smiled at Shida, as if a switch had been flipped in her mind. "Close as can be," she replied. "We've been through a lot together." Then, once again surprising Shida, Nia pushed herself off the wall and closed the gap between them with a single last step, before wrapping her arms around the feline and holding on tight. Shida stood there dumbstruck for a moment, freezing under the sudden physical contact. "You know, you shouldn't bottle things up either. It's not good for you," Nia softly said, almost right into her ear. "It's good that you didn't go off at the commander, but now it's safe to let it out." After she said that, the two stood like that in silence for a few moments. Finally, Shida softly spoke up, saying, "So, Nia, Miat don't really do hugs, usually." "Oh, sorry," Nia replied, immediately letting go of the feline and taking a small step back. "You look so much like a human, I completely forgot." However, as soon as the securing hold was gone, Shida found herself missing it, and she let her head sink forward, placing it against Nia's shoulder. "It's all right," she said. "I don't even know why I said it." "It's fine," Nia said, finding a compromise in lifting her hands and gently putting them on Shida's back, while letting the feline rest against her. Nia was a tall woman, even taller than Shida, and so her long arms easily enveloped her slightly huddled form. "You've been going through this a lot more than I have already. I can see why it would be hard to relax and let things take their course now all of a sudden." She was right. It was a lot. However, Shida didn't reply. She just stood there, pressing her face into Nia's blouse. After a few seconds, Nia spoke up once again. Her voice was clearly still empathetic, however, there was also a clear hint of an urge she could no longer suppress carrying within it. I'm guessing that means that you and James are pretty close as well, huh? She asked, lifting one hand off Sheeta's back and placed it on the back of her head instead, letting it slowly glide over Sheeta's wild mane of hair. Sheeta couldn't help but let out a single quiet giggle at that. So far, being nosy certainly was the most sisterly thing Nia had done. It's complicated, she replied, not really knowing what else to say about the topic in brief terms. Nia halted for a moment, a bundle of Sheeta's hair in her hands. Well, in that case, I think meeting everyone will have to wait for a bit, she said contemplatively, rubbing the strand of hair in between two of her fingers. I have an idea during which you can tell me all about it. Sheeta lifted her head for the first time in a while to curiously look at Nia. Nia, however, excused herself for a moment, assuring that she would be right back, before hurrying out of the room with quick steps, leaving Sheeta to look after her, flabbergasted. Shortly after, and before Sheeta had even had much time to ponder what the woman was on about, Nia had already returned, now carrying a pouch or bag of sorts, and as Sheeta looked at her expectantly, she triumphantly pulled out a brush of sorts. Then, what must have been half an hour later, Sheeta sat on the edge of her provided bed, looking down at her feet and her ears deliberately folded forward, while Nia was kneeling on the bed behind her, meticulously working her way through Sheeta's wild hair with the brush, while intently listening to everything Sheeta had to tell her. Since she had only gotten the brief summary of events previously, Nia demanded that this time no detail be spared, as she interrogated Sheeta about her and James's relationship. And Sheeta, having nothing else to say, complied, recounting everything from her meeting with James, them slowly becoming closer after the explosion in Curious Laboratory, the destruction of the terminal in James's room, leading to their first night together, as it was now a not-monitored space, and finally their last night together. She even confided in Nia the brief time she and James had spent split, after the matriarch had tried to make her influence known, as well as them meeting for the first time afterwards. All the while, Nia was brushing through her hair nearly strand by strand. At first, she had been unsure about this whole procedure. However, after the first bit of pulling and tearing had been over, it had indeed started to feel rather nice. It was almost meditative, the way the brush's bristles glided through her hair time after time. Nia was clearly very curious and interrupted her explanations often to coax some more information out of her. Finally, after everything had been said, Nia chuckled and quietly commented, "My brother the ambassador, going bravely where no man has gone before." "What was that?" Sheeta asked, slightly turning her head, carefully so she wouldn't accidentally tear on her own hair in the process. "Oh, nothing," Nia said, giggling. Finally, she put the brush down and pulled over her open pouch, holding it out so Sheeta could look inside it. "Now, is there anything else you want to do? Spraying? Braiding? I've got some nice accessories that I'm sure will look great on you." "No, thank you." Sheeta immediately declined, perhaps a bit too hastily. "I'm good." "Oh well," Nia replied, shrugging, and closed the bag after dropping the brush back into it. "Was worth a shot." She then crawled across the bed, swinging her legs over its edge to sit down right next to Sheeta. "But I have to say, possibly getting an off-world as an in-law isn't something I would have expected when James left Earth," she commented, slightly absent-mindedly, and leaned forward, propping herself up with her elbows on her knees. "And I didn't think I'd be dating an ambassador any time soon," Sheeta gave back, leaning backwards and supporting herself with one hand on the bed, while the other carefully stroked through her own hair, feeling its weird slackness now that it had been combed to the nth degree. Or really anyone for that matter. "Touché," Nia replied. "But I'm glad things worked out with the two of you. I know we basically just met, but I already like you the most out of the girlfriends he's had, and you're competing for the spot of #1 partner overall." Sheeta's ears suddenly stood up straight. That sounded like free information to her. "Should I feel bad now? Because that doesn't exactly speak to James's general ability to pick his partners now, does it?" she asked in a slightly teasing manner, wanting to soften Nia up a bit before beginning an interrogation of her own. However, apparently Nia and James weren't all that alike in many ways, and Nia didn't need any buttering up before she started to happily talk all about her brother and his experiences in the ways of love. "You're fine. Where we come from, there's a saying, even a blind chicken will find a seat sometimes." She laughed loudly, pushing herself up to pat Sheeta on the shoulder. Sheeta didn't know what a chicken is, but she felt like she got the general sense of the proverb. She also didn't want to interrupt the flow of the conversation because there were still some interesting bits of Nia's earlier statement that she wanted to press on. "So, if I'm your favourite girlfriend, then who's my competition for the #1 partner spot?" she asked directly, feeling no need to hide her interest behind flowery language anymore, and attentively turned her ears in Nia's direction, awaiting the answer. "The guy he had back in his training days," Nia said, dismissively waving it off. Was a real hoot, that guy. But I also know him much longer, so I'll refrain from my judgment until you've had the chance to prove yourself. She'd chuckled. How generous of you, she gave back with playful sarcasm. This made Nia instantly snap up in played excitation, and she warningly raised a finger in Sheeta's direction. You better watch out. I can tag any girlfriend of his and add an X to it real quick, so don't you get cute with me, she said, always managing to make it through the whole sentence in a stern tone. However, right at the end she did break, losing her posture as she started to chuckle, her finger slowly sinking down with each spastic breath. Sheeta also began to snigger, looking down at the display. Since neither of the two added any fuel to the fire, the laughter slowly faded out, and what was followed quickly by a bout of uncomfortable silence. Sheeta felt a sting in the back of her mind, and she saw on Nia's face that she likely felt just the same. She missed him. Should we talk about something else? Nia suggested carefully, her face still hesitantly happy, but slowly darkening after the silence had more than overstayed its welcome. Probably a good idea, Sheeta said, and decided to push herself off the bed, jumping to her feet and turning on the spot to look at Nia. Do you want to go greet the others now? They're probably going to be mad that we even waited this long to see them. I'd love to, Nia replied, but she was just about to push herself up as well, when she suddenly took a good, long look at Sheeta and sank down again, cocking her head to the side. Hesitantly, she added, but before we do that, not to be rude, but I have to ask, just what are you wearing there? Sheeta looked down at herself, only now realizing that she still looked like she had decided to walk into a closet and just wear whatever clothes had randomly stuck to her this morning. Don't ask, she replied bashfully, averting her eyes from Nia. I should probably change now that I am among people who know how to dress again. Nia gave her a soft smile and now finally got up as well. I'll wait outside then. Take your time, she said. I left the room at a brisk pace, leaving Sheeta alone for a moment. Sheeta quickly and quietly took a more sensible change of clothes out of her bag, even resorting to wearing her chain top once again, since she really wanted to leave a better impression now that she deliberately stated that she would dress sensibly again. Once she was confident that she looked like someone resembling a proper member of society again, she followed Nia out of the door. Nia looked at her with a similar gaze as the one she had previously studied her with, also reminding Sheeta of the one James had had on his face the first time the two saw each other out of uniform. Humans did have a different sense of what sensible clothing looked like, but at least Sheeta felt comfortable showing herself off like this, so she was much less coy about Nia's judging gaze this time. Nia did have the tact to not ask, what are you wearing again, even though she clearly wanted to, and so the two women quickly started to make their way to the other holding cells, where Curie and Moore were being held. She'd expected those two to not have left their rooms without explicit permission to do so. The humans passing them on their way gave the two interested looks, some even turning their heads to look after them for a bit longer. And although Sheeta was used to being stared at by people passing her in corridors, this was different, as the gazes following her now were ones of pure curiosity and excitement, instead of the usual, barely restrained judgment and distaste. She would have to get used to this new brand of prying gazes. When they finally arrived at Moore's cell, and loudly opened his door, it seemed that they had inadvertently given the old lady a bit of a fright, since she turned towards them with a brief expression of shock. However, her face immediately softened again when she first saw who it was that had arrived for her, and then it turned to a, this time more elated, form of surprise, when she slowly began to realise who Sheeta had brought with her there. "Oh my," she said, walking up to the two women with wide eyes and bowing down to study the two. "My eyes must be deceiving me." Nia stood awestruck for a moment while staring up at the much larger woman. Then she quickly walked forwards. "They aren't," she said, immediately rushing forward to wrap her arms around one of Moore's legs, and the giant woman gently lowered one of her claws onto Nia's back. "It's great to finally meet you in person." "Likewise," Moore replied, softly rubbing Nia's back while apparently enjoying the embrace, although maybe more in its spirit than its awkward execution. "Although I never imagined it would be under these circumstances." Then Moore turned her large head so she could focus her eye on Sheeta, while Nia peeled herself loose from the giant. "How do things go with the humans?" she asked with slight hesitation, and she must have seen Sheeta's facade slightly slip, because her gaze immediately turned into concern right after she had asked. "I think they believe me," Sheeta replied after a moment of contemplation. "At least they didn't outright dismiss me, but for now their hands are tied. Oh, and we're still considered captives for the moment, but low-risk ones, so we're allowed to wander this deck if we want to. Not that you could leave it if you wanted to." "We're going to have to wait and see what the higher-ups decide on," Nia added, while stepping away from Moore until she reached a distance at which the massively differently sized woman could look at each other comfortably, but I got a good hunch that they'll probably want to have this matter resolved. Moore nodded her large head, apparently pondering their response for a moment, before clearly coming to the conclusion that, in that case, things would surely be handled and she could ease a bit on her worrying. She took a long, relieved breath, and her posture visibly relaxed. "Very well, then. I'm sure things are going to be all right," the giant stated, briefly shaking herself out, making her long fur wildly fly through the air. She'd noticed Nia still staring at Moore with a contemplative demeanour. She guessed that the human hadn't seen many giant off-worlders in person yet, and still getting used to the sight. Also, she seemed to be getting some ideas while looking at the masses of fur the old one was clad in. Finally, she snapped out of her thoughts and candidly asked, "So, Curious also here, right? Should we go get them as well? Or do you maybe just want to rest?" Moore chuckled lowly, stating, "Dearie, I've been stuck on the ship without being able to do anything for the last 3 weeks. The last thing I want to do right now is rest." Which was a fair enough assessment of the situation. They let the giant out of her room and got on their way to pick up the cyborg, so everyone would be able to spend some time together and use this as a proper welcome to the ship. However, to Sheeta's great surprise, when they arrived at Curious' cell, the door was already open, and an excitedly chittering group of humans was standing around, talking into the room. "Nah, nothing so sophisticated, it's just military grade," a female soldier with long brown hair laughingly explained, leaning half against the doorframe and proudly presenting her left arm, the sleeve of which she had slightly pulled back, exposing about half of her forearm. "But look, I can do this with it." While the new arrivals were still left to wonder what sort of conversation they had run in on, the woman suddenly started to seemingly flex her thumb and pinky finger towards each other, only that they never stopped flexing. Sheeta felt her stomach turn, as the hand kept bending and bending in an unnatural way, to the point where the tips of the 2 fingers actually touched each other, and the hand was basically folded in half. Her fine ears also picked up on the quiet, mechanical grinding noises that came from the appendage, and all but confirmed that it wasn't made of flesh and blood, despite the convincing fake skin that covered its surface. She quickly averted her gaze and frantically tried to keep herself from retching at the sight, her hair standing up on end. Behind her, she noticed Moore having a very similar reaction to hers, as the giant's whole body seemed to shudder, as she also averted her gaze. "Fascinating!" A familiar, synthetic voice came from the direction of the room, although its owner remained out of sight for the moment. "And this extra mobility is very useful for someone in your field, or was it a personal request of yours?" The human woman snorted, allowing her hand to spring back into its natural position, and dismissively waving Curie off. "As if! They're just cheaper to make this way, and since it doesn't cause any problems, nobody cares enough to complain," she explained, briefly reaching up to stroke some of her long hair out of her face. "Fascinating," Curie repeated, and Curie could see them in front of her inner eye, the way they would start to fiddle with their hands while pondering this new information. "On second thought, maybe we should leave Curie alone for a bit. They seem to be having fun," she had commented, still recovering from the sudden and unwanted demonstration of her mechanical limbs' capabilities right in front of her, and feeling little to no desire to get any closer to its owner and her friends. Hearing that, Nia turned her head, looking at the feline confusedly. However, Sheeta's decision had already come too late, because while a human's ears weren't quite as good as hers, they were good enough to hear their approach, especially now that she had spoken out loud. One of the soldiers had turned his head, checking who was approaching the group there, and his gaze shifted into disbelief as his eyes widened. So quietly that not even Sheeta could hear him. He mouthed something to himself, and his eyes darted around between the new arrivals as he slowly stood up straighter, slightly quaking with excitement. As if he wanted to reconfirm that others were also seeing what he saw as well, he turned to the shoulder next to him. However, she was still focused on what was most likely Curie, standing in the room in front of them, and therefore didn't pay attention to the corridor. The soldier who had spotted them looked from his colleagues to the approaching off-worlders, and back again for a few seconds, all quietly saying something to them, before finally losing his patience and nudging his colleague with the back of his hand, making her face annoyingly snap around to him. Agitatedly, she hissed something in their native language with a dour expression, while he seemed to quickly try to explain himself, while also pointing down the hall towards Sheeta. The two's exchanges also caught the attention of the other humans around them, and one by one, they turned towards the approaching group, their expressions changed into awe. Finally, even the bothered woman turned her head, immediately stopping her grouching. She also uttered the first words in the conversation that Sheeta could understand. Damn, they weren't kidding. Sheeta's mind jumped to her first encounter with new humans back in the station, and especially their reflex to try and touch her, immediately, and she subconsciously took a step back away from the gaggle of people. Nia had the entirely opposite reaction, suddenly stepping forward and waving towards the soldiers, making it almost seem like she wanted to show off in front of her peers. More made up the middle ground, seeming carefully optimistic, while also obviously not having forgotten the cybernetic display just seconds earlier. Apparently, Nia's friendly approach had opened some sort of floodgate, because many of the soldiers took it as an invited to scurry over to them, making it a sort of walking race, with everyone wanting to be the first to arrive and greet the new people, while also none of them wanted to burst into straight-up running, causing the entire group of soldiers to awkwardly powerwalk in Nia's direction. About at the same time, Curie, who probably wondered what all the fuss was about all of a sudden, stuck their head out of the doorway and looked down the hall, their red eyes softly glowing against the ambient light. When the humans had finally reached a distance at which a conversation could be reasonably held, there were way too many greetings and explanations for Sheeta to remember any of them specifically, and she tried her best to remain at a respectful distance to everybody, while not straight up appearing rude by backing away from anyone, even slightly approaching her. Although she did make sure to keep track of where the woman with the fake hand was at all times, just to be sure. The soldiers seemed to be split about right down the middle in who they found more interesting. The feline looking so much like themselves, or the fur-clad giant reaching almost all the way up to the ceiling while standing at full height. Most of the time, the primates excitedly talked among each other, mostly in ways that Sheeta didn't understand, so she didn't quite feel the need to pay too much attention to the conversation at hand, though it did slightly irritate her when one of them would point to her tail, raise their hands to imitate her large ears, while obviously commenting on her body in a language she did not understand. She could feel this interaction start to take a lot out of her already, and she hoped that the excited Deathworlders would soon calm down a little bit, at least to the point where a conversation could be held with them. To try and minimise the draining of her social button cells, she somehow managed to squeeze and weave her way past the chittering group, and quickly excused herself while she walked over to Curie, who was still watching the exchange from a distance. "Heya," she greeted the cyborg, slightly crouching down to be on eye level with them. "Hello, Sheeta. Did your exchange with the humans go well?" Curie immediately replied in a chipper yet serious tone, focusing their attention completely onto her. "As well as it could have gone, I guess," Sheeta responded, feeling this might be the best way to relay the information by now. "What will happen now?" Curie asked, slightly tilting their body. "I don't know yet," Sheeta replied honestly. "The humans still need to decide that. For now we're going to have to stay here for a while. I hope you don't mind." "Oh, not at all!" Curie immediately and excitedly piped up, pushing themselves up a bit further than before. "I just got glimpses of it before with James, but didn't quite grasp its extent. The humans truly have a fascinating relationship with their technology. I haven't talked to them enough to make any definitive statements yet, but considering the nature of James's work, and now the behaviour that the soldiers on this ship present, it almost seems like the line between natural development and technological progress are beginning to blur for their species. I would very much like to spend some more time here and truly experience just how far this dilution of borders reaches for them, and learn as much from it as I can. Did you, by chance, see Chris's hand earlier?" Sheeta slightly shuddered at the thought. "I sure did," she confirmed, shaking the creeping feeling out of her body. Then, once she was reasonably sure that she had regained her composure, she added, "But since we're staying anyway, I'm glad you like it here. It seems that you're right at home." "Don't think I didn't see you shaking there." A high voice from behind her made Sheeta turn her head to look back at the group of humans, one of whom had obviously addressed her. To her slight annoyance, it of course had to be the human cyborg approaching her and Curie, having loosened from the rest of the group, the most of whom were currently busy seemingly taking a group picture with Moore as the centrepiece. The giant had stretched out her arms wide, putting her claws on the shoulders of two humans standing furthest of her, while almost the entire rest of the group had found space somewhere in between her two hands, grinning excited like kittens. The soldier with the fake hand didn't seem to be interested in being part of that, and had instead grouped up with Nia and the man who had annoyed her earlier, all of whom were now walking over to Sheeta and Curie. "You'll have to forgive her. Cybernetics are generally seen as affronts against nature in the community, and she has therefore been raised to disdain them," Curie informed. And of course, the way they said it so matter-of-factly made it seem like Sheeta was behaving extremely childish. And maybe she was. She wasn't even sure about that anymore. Who was the crazy one here? "I just need to get used to it," Sheeta said, trying her best to avoid constantly glancing down at the offending appendage. "Well, if you want to, you can get as familiar with it as you like." The woman, who was apparently named Chrissy, replied suggestively, raising the cybernetic appendage to make some sort of gesture that Sheeta didn't entirely understand. However, the implication behind it was quite obvious, as she stared at the woman, sort of speechless for a moment. Was she being serious? "Back off, Asmodeus, that girl is taken," Nia facetiously warned the woman, admonishingly raising a finger in her face in a gesture that looked a little too confrontational to Sheeta, although the woman didn't seem to mind. "What, she's been on board for all of an hour and you've already snatched her away?" The male soldier now chimed in, looking at Nia with mockingly raised eyebrows. "By Mammon's greed, woman, just how beguiling are you?" She'd knew neither who Asmodeus or Mammon were, but apparently humans among themselves like to throw around a lot of names. Or maybe it was just this group of humans. Not by me, Nia annoyedly clarified, visibly rolling her eyes at the man. Then, more serious, she added, but by my brother, so you'd better believe I'll make sure none of you try to get your grubby little hands on her. Well, I think she can decide that for herself, thank you very much, the female cyborg now replied, putting her hands on her hips and shifting her weight to standoffishly lean in Nia's direction, despite the address being a good bit taller than herself. Of course you would say that, Nia immediately snapped back, folding her arms and returning the woman's gaze with a stern look. She looked back and forth between the bickering primates and witlessly uttered, causing them to snap around towards her, making her immediately regret opening her mouth. She didn't really feel like she had any desire to become a part of the mess that was unfolding in front of her eyes. Almost immediately, the humans started snickering. It took them a moment to regain their composure, and Nia slowly stepped forward, waving her hand apologetically. Sorry about that, she said, still slightly chuckling. I guess we should turn it down a bit for you. She'd returned Nia's smile, but by now she really felt drained. She raised her gaze, looking over at more. The old lady happily engaged with the humans, talking to them excitedly, and letting them hold her claws or brush her fur with a completely calm face. Apparently the thought of them being Deathworlders had completely disappeared from her mind, as soon as they had started to socially engage with her. Then she'd turned her gaze once more, looking over at Curie, who was already sizing up Chris's prosthetic again, obviously still eager to learn more about it and the soldier's life with the appendage. And finally, she raised her gaze towards Nia once again. It's fine, she said, brushing through her still smoothed hair with her hand, enjoying the strange yet not at all uncomfortable feeling. I think I just need to lie down for a bit. Please, excuse me. She pushed herself past the group, not waiting for an answer, and immediately started on making her way back to her cell, Nia looking after her with a worried expression. All right, rest well, she softly said, tilting her head to the side as she watched Sheeta leave. What, already? Come on, you just got here, Chrissy yelled after her. However, her efforts were immediately rewarded by a solid knock to her gut by the man still standing next to her. Dude, back off. If she wants to go, let her go, he admonished the woman, and it almost immediately caused another bout of bickering in their native language, which Sheeta ignored. None of the other humans tried to stop her as she weaved past them, only stopping for a second to give Moore a brief nod of goodbye. However, she could still feel the primate's gazes on her as she left. In no time at all, she had made it back to her cell, having made sure to memorize the way well, as she happily dropped onto her bed, feeling not especially tired, but drained. It was only now that she noticed how much colder it was on board the human ship. So far, so much else had been on her mind, that she didn't have time to notice herself giving off a lot more heat than usual, as her body tried to compensate for the dropping temperature. Now, feeling the cold sheets against her skin, she actually began to shiver, and quickly started to roll herself up in the large blanket provided for her. Still, the empty sheets needed some time before they had absorbed enough of her body heat to start and make things cozy, so she lay there for a while, wrapped in cold cloths and shivering.